Aries. Before we talk about money, let me ask you something. If you've been seeing 444 lately, not once, not randomly, but right when you're tired of pushing, right when you're questioning your direction, this isn't about luck. This is a green light moment, not the kind where someone gives you permission, but the kind where something inside you quietly unlocks, and you realize you don't have to stay where you are anymore. As a friend, I'll say this gently: you're not lacking drive. You're lacking alignment. And that's why this moment feels different. If this already feels familiar, type "I see it" in the comments, just for yourself. Now pause for a second. Take one slow breath and notice where in your life you've been holding on even though you're ready to move. Because in the next moment, we're stepping into why this door is appearing now and what it's quietly asking you to choose. All right, so let's stay right inside that quiet space you just noticed, the one that doesn't rush you forward, but doesn't let you fall back either. As a friend, I want to tell you something I've learned about Aries, and I say this with respect. You're incredibly good at moving, at starting, at pushing life forward with force and will. But what rarely gets talked about is how often you keep moving even after the reason has quietly expired. That's why this moment matters. Not because of money, not because of signs, but because for the first time in a while, you're not being pulled by urgency. You're being met by awareness. There's a difference. Urgency feels loud. It demands action now, or else something terrible might happen. Awareness is softer. It doesn't shout. It waits for you to notice. And when you do, it changes the way everything feels. You might recognize this as a strange calm mixed with restlessness, like standing at a green light without immediately stepping on the gas, not frozen, just aware. That's not hesitation, that's intelligence. Aries often believes that slowing down means losing momentum, but there's another truth that comes with age. Sometimes slowing down is how momentum becomes direction. Here's something I want you to reflect on, gently. No judgment, just honesty. When was the last time you asked yourself whether the life you're maintaining still matches the person you've become? Not the person you had to be, not the person who survived, but the person who knows more now. Because growth doesn't always announce itself with excitement. Sometimes it arrives as quiet discomfort, a subtle sense that you've outgrown a rhythm that once felt necessary. This is where Aries energy matures, not into softness, but into precision. You start to feel the difference between effort that builds and effort that only maintains. And that's when your relationship with money begins to shift. Not because money suddenly appears, but because you stop chasing outcomes and start choosing alignment. You begin to notice how certain choices drain you even if they look productive on the surface, and how other choices, smaller, quieter ones, restore your sense of agency. That's the real door here. The door is realizing you're allowed to want a different structure, not just a bigger reward. Let me ask you something, just between us. If no one needed anything from you for a moment, what decision would feel most honest right now? Not the bravest, not the smartest, the most honest. Because honesty is where sustainable abundance begins, not motivation, not pressure. And this is important. You don't need to dismantle your whole life to honor this moment. You don't need a dramatic leap. Sometimes the most powerful shift is allowing yourself to question what you've never questioned before, to stop equating stability with staying, to stop equating movement with progress. You're not here to repeat survival patterns forever. You're here to refine them until they no longer feel like survival at all. There's a quiet confidence that comes from that realization, a grounded kind of fire, less explosive, more intentional. And when Aries reaches that place, opportunities tend to feel less like rescue and more like collaboration. Take a breath here. Just notice what resonates. You don't need answers yet, because what's unfolding next isn't about pushing harder. It's about seeing more clearly what kind of life you're actually ready to build now. And that clarity, that's where things begin to move differently. There's something subtle that happens right after that realization settles in. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft internal release, It feels like pressure leaving your chest without you asking it to. Like loosening a grip you didn't even realize you were holding. That's what this green light actually is. Not permission, not approval, and definitely not a signal from outside of you telling you what to do. It's the moment the inner resistance eases, the moment you stop arguing with yourself about why you should stay where you are. As a friend, let me say this honestly. You've never really needed someone to push you forward. You've always been good at that on your own. What's been quietly slowing you down is something else. The weight of needing every move to make sense, the habit of measuring your worth by how fast you progress, the unspoken belief that stopping even briefly means falling behind. For a long time, that pressure felt useful. It sharpened you. It helped you survive. It gave you an edge when you needed one. But now, it's starting to feel heavy instead of helpful. And when that happens, the universe doesn't usually shout. It waits for the moment when you finally notice the tension and realize you don't have to carry it anymore. That's when paths appear that were always there. You may find yourself noticing conversations you used to dismiss. Ideas you once thought were impractical suddenly feel possible. Opportunities that don't demand urgency begin to feel more trustworthy than the ones that rush you. This isn't hesitation. It's discernment. There's a maturity that comes when Aries energy stops trying to outrun uncertainty and starts listening for resonance instead. Here's a thought I want to offer you, gently. What if the real blockage wasn't lack of opportunity, but the constant pressure to prove something before you were ready? When that pressure softens, something interesting happens. You stop forcing movement, and movement starts responding to you. That's why the best sign right now isn't a sudden win or an external reward showing up overnight. It's the quiet relief of realizing you're no longer trapped in a role you outgrew. You might notice this in small ways. A job that once felt like a lifeline now feels optional. A routine that once gave you structure now feels negotiable. A version of yourself that survived by pushing hard starts giving way to a version that chooses deliberately. That's freedom. Not the loud kind, the grounded kind. Let me ask you something, just to let it echo for a moment. If staying exactly where you are no longer feels mandatory, what choice becomes available to you for the first time? You don't have to answer out loud, just notice what surfaces. Because when the inner block lifts, you don't immediately run forward. You look around first. You reassess what actually deserves your energy now. Not what once did, not what looks impressive, but what feels sustainable. And that's where real momentum is born. The kind that doesn't burn you out, the kind that doesn't require constant urgency, the kind that grows because it fits who you are becoming. This is why the green light feels different this time. It's not pulling you away from your life. It's releasing you from staying stuck inside an old version of it. Take a quiet breath here. Let the idea settle. Because what opens next isn't asking you to rush. It's asking you to recognize that the road feels clear now because you've changed the way you stand on it. There's a quiet shift that happens after you realize the road feels clear again. Not excitement, not urgency. More like a subtle question rising from inside you. If the way forward is open, why does it still feel unfamiliar to step into it? That's where this idea of a new money door begins to reveal its deeper meaning. Because it isn't waiting somewhere outside your life. It isn't hidden in a job posting, a message, or a sudden opportunity. It's closer than that. It lives in the moment you give yourself permission to choose differently. As your friend, I want to say something that might land softly but honestly. Many Aries don't struggle because they lack ability. They struggle because their lives quietly become built around obligation. Not dramatic obligation, the subtle kind. The kind that sounds like responsibility. The kind that once kept everything stable. You get used to doing what works, what pays the bills, what people expect you to keep doing because you've always done it well. And over time, those choices harden into routines. Routines turn into identities, and one day you wake up realizing you're living inside a structure you never consciously chose. That's not failure. That's adaptation. But adaptation has an expiration date. The door you're sensing now doesn't open because the world changed. It opens because you're starting to notice how much of your energy is spent maintaining something that no longer reflects who you are. This is where Aries energy deepens. You begin to feel the difference between effort that builds a future and effort that simply keeps things from falling apart. Money responds differently to those two energies. When your actions come from obligation, money tends to feel tight, predictable, limited by the shape of the life you're already living. When your actions come from choice, even small ones, something shifts, not overnight, not magically, but steadily. You start to sense where your attention actually wants to go, what you'd explore if you weren't so busy keeping everything running, what ideas keep returning quietly, asking not to be ignored anymore. Let me ask you something, gently. If nothing in your life required maintenance for a moment, what would you be curious enough to try? Curiosity is an underrated currency. It points to doors long before they become visible. And this isn't about abandoning responsibility. It's about introducing intention. Sometimes the most meaningful financial shift begins with one small decision that isn't driven by duty. A skill you explore because it energizes you. A conversation you have without needing it to lead anywhere immediately. A project you allow yourself to start without guaranteeing the outcome. Those choices don't look impressive from the outside, but internally, they change your relationship with possibility. You stop asking what you should do and start noticing what you're drawn toward. That's the doorway. Not a dramatic leap, not a risky gamble. Just a quiet reorientation toward what feels alive again. Aries doesn't need more hustle. You need alignment that allows your natural drive to move toward something that actually belongs to you. Take a moment here. Notice what feels lighter when you imagine choosing it. Notice what feels heavy when you imagine staying exactly as you are. That contrast is information. And as you begin to honor it, even in small ways, your sense of choice expands. With it, your sense of agency. With that, your capacity to receive opportunities that fit the life you're becoming. This is why the door doesn't announce itself. It waits for you to notice the handle has been in your hand all along. And once you see that, you don't rush through. You step forward deliberately, aware that what opens next isn't just about money, but about building a life where your choices finally feel like your own. There's a certain kind of tired that doesn't ask for rest. It doesn't come from doing too much in one day. It comes from holding yourself together for a long time, without ever letting yourself ask whether it still makes sense. That's the tired you're touching now, not the kind that collapses loudly. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up when you realize you've been strong for so long that strength has started to feel like a requirement instead of a choice. As your friend, I want to sit with you here for a moment, because Aries rarely admits this out loud. You're used to carrying pressure without complaint, used to pushing through discomfort because it once kept things moving, used to telling yourself, just a little longer, I can handle this. And you can. That's never been the question. The question is, why you still are. This green light moment doesn't arrive at the peak of ambition. It arrives after endurance, after months or years of doing what needed to be done, even when it quietly cost you something inside. That's why it doesn't feel explosive. It feels like a soft exhale you didn't know you were holding. There's a maturity that comes when Aries stops fighting fatigue and starts listening to it. Because this kind of weariness isn't weakness, it's information. It tells you that the version of life you've been sustaining was built for an earlier chapter. A chapter where survival mattered more than fulfillment, where proving yourself mattered more than choosing yourself. You didn't do anything wrong there. You did what worked, but something has shifted. You may notice that the things you once tolerated now feel heavier than they should. Conversations drain you faster. Responsibilities feel less meaningful. Even success, when it comes, doesn't land the way it used to. That doesn't mean you're ungrateful. It means you're evolving. Aries often believes growth should feel energizing. But there's another phase of growth that feels like grief. Grief for the person you were who could carry everything without asking for change. And here's the part I want you to hear clearly. This moment isn't asking you to break your life apart. It's asking you to stop forcing yourself to endure what no longer fits. There's a quiet courage in that. The courage to admit without drama, this isn't sustainable for me anymore. Not because it's impossible, but because it's misaligned. Let me ask you something softly. If you allowed yourself to stop tolerating one thing you've been enduring, what would create space immediately? You don't need to act on it yet. Just notice the answer. Because when Aries reaches this point, something important happens. Your drive becomes more selective. Your fire stops burning indiscriminately and starts warming what truly matters. That's not losing edge, that's gaining wisdom. You begin to understand that strength isn't about how much you can carry. It's about knowing when carrying something is no longer an act of growth. This kind of awareness changes how you move forward, not with urgency, with intention. And intention has a way of clearing paths without you having to push through walls anymore. Take a quiet breath here. Let yourself acknowledge how far you've come without minimizing the cost. Because the moment you stop judging your tiredness and start respecting it, you don't just feel relief. You feel readiness. Readiness to choose differently. Readiness to redirect your energy. Readiness to step toward a life that doesn't require constant endurance to sustain. And that's where this moment is guiding you. Not toward collapse, but toward a future where strength feels lighter because it's finally aligned with who you are now. There's a moment that arrives quietly after you stop enduring. Not dramatic, not rebellious, just honest. It sounds like a simple thought you've avoided for a long time. Something like, I can't keep choosing safety if it keeps costing me possibility. That's where this truth begins to surface. Because money does not respond to comfort the way we wish it would. It responds to movement, not reckless movement, intentional movement. And as your friend, I want to name something gently. Aries often carries two fears at once, even if you rarely say them out loud. One is the fear of not having enough. The other is the fear of stepping into uncertainty and losing control. So you build a life that feels secure, predictable income, reliable routines, familiar responsibilities. And for a while, that works. But safety, when held too tightly, begins to shrink your world. Not suddenly, gradually. It narrows your choices until you stop noticing how little room you have to breathe. This is where many people misunderstand money. They think more money comes from doing the same thing better, working harder, optimizing effort. But new money almost always comes from new thinking. And new thinking requires you to tolerate a certain level of discomfort, not chaos, not recklessness, just the unease of not knowing exactly how something will turn out. That's not weakness, that's growth. Aries energy was never meant to live inside a locked routine forever. You're built to initiate, to experiment, to learn by engaging with the unknown. But over time, responsibility teaches you caution, and caution, when unexamined, turns into avoidance. So instead of risking failure, you risk stagnation. Here's the subtle shift that matters right now. You're no longer being asked to choose between safety and danger. You're being asked to choose between safety and expansion. There's a difference. Expansion doesn't demand you burn everything down. It asks you to take one step that stretches your current identity. One skill you've been curious about but never prioritized. One side path you've dismissed because it didn't feel guaranteed. One conversation you've avoided because it might lead somewhere unfamiliar. Those are not reckless risks. They're controlled experiments. And controlled experiments are how sustainable abundance is built. Let me ask you something softly. If you knew you wouldn't fail completely, what would you be willing to try? Notice what comes up before logic interferes. Because the moment you allow yourself to explore without demanding certainty, your relationship with money begins to change. You stop seeing it as something to protect at all costs, and start seeing it as something that responds to courage paired with wisdom. There's a mature fire in that. A grounded kind of boldness, not the kind that jumps without looking, the kind that looks carefully and jumps anyway. You don't need a perfect plan to begin. You need permission to begin imperfectly. And here's the part that often surprises Aries. When you take a measured risk aligned with who you're becoming, you don't just open doors financially. You reclaim a sense of agency that money alone can't provide. You remember what it feels like to choose growth over comfort, to invest energy where it feels alive again, to trust that learning counts even before results appear. That's when momentum returns, not as pressure, as curiosity. Take a breath here. Feel where your body tightens when you imagine staying exactly as you are, and where it softens when you imagine stretching just a little beyond it. That contrast is your compass, because money doesn't move toward fear. It moves toward readiness. And readiness doesn't mean knowing everything in advance. It means being willing to step forward without asking safety to guarantee the outcome first. That willingness quietly changes everything. There's a quieter strength that begins to surface right about now, not the kind that proves anything, not the kind that asks to be seen, just a steady presence that says, I'm ready to own what I choose next. That's when this sign tends to appear, not as rescue, not as a blessing dropped from the sky, but as a mirror. Because at this point, no one is coming to save you. And the truth is, you don't want that anymore. As a friend, I can tell you this. The moment you stop waiting for permission is the moment your life starts to feel like it belongs to you again. For a long time, you may have carried an unspoken hope that circumstances would shift first, that something external would make the decision easier. That clarity would arrive before responsibility did. But that's not how this phase works. This phase begins when you recognize that whatever you choose next will work because you will stand behind it. Not because it's guaranteed, not because it's perfect, but because you're willing to stay present with it. Aries energy matures beautifully here. You stop measuring choices by how fast they pay off and start measuring them by whether they reflect who you are now. You become less interested in shortcuts and more interested in stability you can sustain. That's the foundation of lasting wealth, not sudden gain, but consistent alignment. There's a shift in language that happens internally. You notice it when you stop saying, I had no choice, and begin saying, this is the choice I'm making. That difference may seem subtle, but it changes everything. Blame dissolves, resentment softens, energy returns. You realize how much power you gave away by believing circumstances were in control, and how much of that power comes back the moment you decide to respond rather than react. This doesn't make life easier overnight, but it makes it clearer. You become more intentional with your time, more selective with your commitments, more honest about what you can and cannot sustain. And here's something important to understand. Responsibility in this sense isn't a burden. It's a relief. It means you're no longer fighting reality or negotiating with it. You're working with it. Let me ask you something gently. If every choice you made from here forward was one you were willing to stand behind completely, what would you stop tolerating immediately? You don't need to answer. Just notice what comes up. Because this phase isn't asking you to be fearless, it's asking you to be accountable in a way that feels grounding, not heavy. You begin to see money differently here, not as something to chase or protect obsessively, but as something that responds to clarity and consistency. You understand that quick wins fade when they're built on avoidance, and that steady growth lasts when it's built on ownership. There's a calm confidence that comes with this. Less urgency, more presence. You trust yourself more because you know you'll adapt if things shift. You stop needing guarantees because you trust your ability to respond. That's real security. Take a quiet moment here. Notice how it feels to imagine making decisions without waiting for someone else to validate them. That feeling, that grounded steadiness is what this sign points toward. Not salvation, not prediction, just readiness. Readiness to build something that holds because you're standing fully inside your choices. And when you live from that place, opportunities don't feel like tests anymore. They feel like conversations. You meet them with clarity, with maturity, with the kind of fire that doesn't burn out quickly because it's fueled by responsibility you've willingly claimed. That's where this moment leads, not to instant results, but to a life that finally feels authored by you. There's a fragile quality to this moment that isn't talked about very often. Not fragile in a weak way. Fragile in the way dawn is fragile before the day fully arrives. This green light doesn't linger. It doesn't hover until you feel ready. It appears quietly, and then it waits just long enough for you to notice what you do next. That's part of its honesty. As your friend, I want to tell you something without drama. Life doesn't repeat signs to pressure you. It repeats moments to observe you. And if fear pulls you back into what's familiar, nothing punishes you for that. The world simply goes quiet again. Not because you failed, but because you chose comfort over readiness. That silence isn't rejection, it's information. Aries energy is bold, but it's also deeply sensitive to momentum. You feel alive when something is moving forward, and restless when it isn't. This moment asks a very specific kind of courage. Not the courage to leap, the courage to act before certainty returns. Because certainty always returns later, after choice, not before it. You may notice a subtle tension now. Part of you understands that something wants to begin. Another part wants proof that it will be worth it. That inner negotiation is human. But this is where many people miss the doorway. They wait for confidence to arrive instead of allowing confidence to be built. Momentum is created by participation, not by waiting until fear disappears. Let me ask you something gently. If you knew this window wouldn't stay open forever, what would you do differently this week? Not dramatically, not heroically, just honestly. Because the action that matters here doesn't need to be big. It needs to be real. A conversation you've been postponing, a skill you've been meaning to explore, a decision you've been circling without landing. Small movement signals readiness more clearly than endless contemplation ever could. And here's an important truth. For Aries, your energy responds to motion, even subtle motion. When you engage, clarity follows. When you delay, doubt grows louder. This isn't about rushing, it's about choosing presence over avoidance. The green light fades when life senses you're no longer listening. Not as punishment, as protection. Because opportunity offered before readiness can become pressure instead of possibility. You are being trusted with timing here. Trusted to respond, not react. Trusted to choose with intention. That's a sign of growth. You may feel a strange mix of excitement and gravity, like standing at the edge of something meaningful without needing to label it yet. That feeling is worth respecting. It means you're close enough to sense the shift, but still free enough to decide how you'll meet it. Aries often underestimates how powerful one aligned action can be. You don't need to change everything. You need to change something. One choice that breaks the pattern. One step that confirms you're listening to yourself now. Let that be your compass. Notice what feels lighter after you imagine taking it. Notice what feels heavier when you imagine staying still. That contrast tells the truth without needing explanation. This moment isn't demanding a transformation. It's inviting participation, and participation doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for presence. Take a breath here. Let the urgency soften into clarity. Because whether this doorway remains visible depends less on fate and more on what you're willing to do before fear finishes talking you out of it. The light doesn't rush you, but it won't wait forever either. And how you respond now quietly shapes the path that appears next. There's a quiet sense of arrival that settles in right about here. Not celebration, not certainty. Just a grounded knowing that something inside you has shifted its weight. You're no longer trying to prove that you can handle more. You already know you can. What's different now is that you don't want your life to be built on endurance alone. As your friend, I want to name this moment for what it really is. It's the moment you stop negotiating your worth with effort. The moment you stop asking how much longer you can push and start asking what kind of life you're actually shaping with that push. This is where Aries steps into a new role, not the one who survives by force, not the one who wins by speed, but the one who chooses direction with intention. There's a subtle confidence in that shift, less noise, more presence. You begin to notice how your energy changes when you act from choice instead of obligation. How money, time, and opportunity feel less like things you chase and more like things you organize around what matters. That's not a personality change. It's an identity refinement. You're still decisive, still courageous, still willing to move first, but now your fire has a container. Instead of scattering yourself across demands and expectations, you start creating flow. flow of attention, flow of resources, flow of choices that build on each other instead of competing for your energy. That's what sustainable momentum feels like. And here's the part that often surprises Aries. When you stop trying to be everything to everyone, life responds with more clarity. Opportunities feel cleaner. Decisions feel less charged. You don't need to rush because you're no longer afraid of missing out. You understand that timing isn't about waiting. It's about readiness. This is where your relationship with luck changes. Luck stops feeling random and starts feeling responsive. Not because you control outcomes, but because you're finally aligned with your own direction. Let me ask you something, softly. If you trusted that your next chapter doesn't require struggle to be meaningful, what would you choose to build differently? Sit with that question for a moment. Notice how your body responds before your mind answers. Because this phase isn't about grand declarations. It's about quiet authorship. You begin writing your life with smaller, more deliberate strokes. You invest where there's resonance. You release what no longer fits without resentment. That's maturity. Not settling, not slowing down, just choosing wisely. You don't wait for permission anymore because you've learned how to listen to yourself. You don't wait for signs to rescue you because you recognize when a moment is asking for participation. And that's the heart of this shift. You're no longer standing on the sidelines of your own becoming. You're stepping into the role of creator, not just of income or opportunity, but of a life that reflects who you are now. There's calm in that, a steady kind of confidence that doesn't need validation. You may not have every answer yet. You don't need them. What you have is alignment. And alignment has a way of attracting the right conversations, the right challenges, the right openings at the right pace. Take a breath here. Let this land without forcing it into action just yet. Because the most important shift has already happened. You've stopped waiting for life to happen to you. You've chosen to meet it, not with urgency, not with fear, but with presence. And from here, whatever unfolds next won't feel like luck finding you. It will feel like you finally stepped into the moment that was quietly waiting for you to arrive. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with now. Not what changed, but how quietly it changed. Because if you listen closely, you might notice something small. The pressure you used to feel isn't shouting anymore. It's stepped back, not gone, just quieter, as if it's finally waiting for you to decide. So here's the question I'll leave open for you tonight. What if this moment wasn't asking you to do more, but to choose differently? Before you answer, try this just for a minute. Don't scroll, don't analyze, don't explain it to anyone. Sit in silence, one slow breath in, one slow breath out, and ask yourself quietly, where in my life do I already know the truth, but haven't trusted myself enough to follow it yet? You don't need to fix it tonight. You don't need a plan. Awareness is enough for now. I've noticed something about people who find their way here, especially Virgos. You don't rush the door when it opens. You study this frame. You listen for the hinges. You want to know if it will hold your weight. That's not fear. That's wisdom. And this is me saying it softly. As a friend, you're allowed to trust that wisdom now. You're allowed to move at your own pace. You're allowed to believe that clarity doesn't have to arrive loudly to be real. If something in this message touched you, leave a comment, even just a word. It helps this space find the people who need it next. And if you want to keep walking this path together, subscribe. The journey doesn't end here. It continues in quieter ways, in deeper layers. The next message is already forming, and when it arrives, you'll recognize it, not by how urgent it feels, but by how true it sounds. Until then, be gentle with yourself. Trust what you felt tonight. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let the moment land and choose yourself without needing to explain why.